welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I know that there were some individuals that had actually asked that were part of a book club from out of state, and as we were just talking about, this has been a really awesome opportunity to be able to bring in people from near and far to be able to partake in what is the keynote of the April theme for our community read in Belmont, Massachusetts, just to specify, not Belmont, California. So while we can't be together in person, it's really heartwarming to see so many people turn out online for this event, both from near and far, like I said. My name is Lauren Fender, and I'm the coordinator of Reference and Public Services at the Belmont Public Library and co-chair of Better Through Books Healing Community Together Committee, better known to most as One Book, One Belmont. I'm delighted to introduce to you this evening Gabrielle Zevin, but before I do that, I just want to thank pretty much all of our community co-sponsors, but first we'll start with the Friends of the Belmont Public Library. Without them, all of the Better Through Books programs wouldn't have been possible, as well as the rest of the library's programs throughout the year, day in and day out. It is because of their support that we are able to provide such wonderful programs in such a variety of ways throughout the year. I would also like to thank the many co-sponsors of One Book, One Belmont beyond the Friends, including Belmont Against Racism, Belmont Books, Belmont Chinese American Association, the Belmont Council on Aging, Belmont Food Collaborative, the Belmont Gallery of Art, the Human Rights Commission, Belmont Library Foundation, Belmont Public Schools, Belmont Religious Council, Belmont Wellness Coalition, the Belmont Women's Club, League of Women Voters, the cohort in Belmont, and the Board of Library Trustees. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn to give it's tough to make it a brief introduction for somebody who's written so much and is so prolific, but I'm going to try and do my best for Gabrielle. Gabrielle Zevin is our keynote speaker for tonight. She's an internationally best-selling and critically acclaimed author whose books have been translated into 38 languages. The title for April's read, The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry, spent several months on the New York Times bestseller list, reached #1 on the National Indie Bestseller list, and was a USA Today bestseller, and has been a bestseller around the world. A.J. Fikry was honored with the Southern California Independent Booksellers Award for Fiction and the Booksellers Prize in Japan, and was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award. The Toronto Globe and Mail called the book a powerful novel about the power of novels. She has written prolifically, including her debut, Margaret Town, which was a selection of the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers program and was longlisted for the James Tiptree Jr. Award. The Hole We're In was a New York Times Editor's Choice title, Of the Hole We're In, the New York Times Book Review wrote, Zevin breathes real life into this tough girl vet, a heroine for our times, recognizable from life, but new to fiction. More recently, young Jane Young won the Southern Book Prize and was one of the Washington Post's 50 notable works of fiction. In a starred review, Kirkus Reviews wrote, this book will not only thoroughly entertain everyone who reads it, it is the most immaculate takedown of slut shaming in literature or anywhere else. Cheers and gratitude to the author. She has written for young readers as well, and is also a screenwriter of Conversations with Other Women, featuring Helena Bonham Carter, for which she received an Independent Spirit Award nomination for Best First Screenplay. She and director Hans Canosa adopted her novel, Memoirs of a Teenage Amnesiac, ALA Best Books for Young Adults, and on the NYPL Books for the Teenage, into the Japanese film, I am absolutely going to mispronounce it. I'm going to try my best, Darekaja Watashi ni Kyuso Wu Shita. She has occasionally written criticism for the New York Times Book Review and NPR's All Things Considered, of which I'm a huge personal fan. And she began her writing career at age 14 as a music critic for the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel. Her Modern Love column was recently read by Sandra Oh for the Modern Love podcast. Zevin is a graduate of Harvard University. She lives in Los Angeles. And her 10th novel, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, will be published by Knopf in 2022 and is being developed into a feature film by Temple Hill and Paramount Studios. So without any further ado, Gabrielle, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me. It's kind of amazing to be doing these virtual events, and you never know who you might be speaking to or where in the world they are. And I'm sort of fascinated with that because you feel almost as if you're speaking from a sort of strange vacuum. But then I realized, like, now that we've all done so many Zoom events, like, you all know exactly what I'm feeling at this moment. But just to begin, I want to mention that when I wrote this book, my publisher sent me a set of questions. So this is quite a bit back. And one of their questions at that time was that AJ Fikry has very specific tastes. How do I think he'd respond to a novel like The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry? And at the time, I remember saying, I think he'd have a lot of complaints. He'd think I'd gotten a lot of things wrong about book selling, about adoption and child rearing, the geography of Massachusetts, brain cancer, the green animals topiary garden of Rhode Island. He'd probably think I made him too cartoonish. But I mean, I can also imagine that if the book crossed AJ's desk on the right day and caught him in just the right mood, maybe he'd write a shelf talker or something like this. Despite its modest size and the liberties its authors takes, The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry has a few lovely moments. Though my taste runs to books that are less sentimental than this one, I'm sure my wife, my daughter, and my best friend, the cop, will love this book, and I will heartily recommend it to them. But if you read between the lines of my response, you'll hear the truth, which is that I am not sure that A.J. Fikry would love The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry. I suspect Fikry would love The Goldfinch, or maybe like The 10th of December, The Sympathizer. And this is a strange position to be in as an author, to have generated someone who you suspect would not quite approve of you. And on a phenomenological level, this was disturbing to me. But then I thought about it some more, and I decided that surely Gatsby would not like Gatsby, and the whale does not come off particularly well in Moby Dick. Humbert Humbert would certainly not approve of Lolita. Anna Karenina would not find Anna Karenina hilarious at all. But the question is, would it be to AJ's taste? And the more I thought about it, the more I had to conclude that I could not say for certain that it would be. But now I'm looking at this whole thing many years later. And in the end, I actually think it's maybe one of the accomplishments of the book, because AJ is enough not me that he doesn't have to approve of the book he is in. So I've probably given a couple of hundred author talks about AJ Fikry over the years. I've spoken everywhere from Beijing to Rome to Fairhope, Alabama, to Belmont, Massachusetts, virtually. I've spoken in red states and blue states, and at this point, pretty much all of the states. I stopped speaking about the book maybe 3 years ago to promote a different book, and then to concentrate on writing a new book. And I actually imagine I won't be called upon to speak about the book much more, as A.J. Fikry is now 7.5 years old, and it will be 10 years since I wrote it next year. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you come to me at the end of a long and winding road, and you have the benefit of my experience, which is to say, I know what most people want to know about the book. But a funny thing is that I feel quite different than the person who wrote A.J. Fikry, and to speak of it makes me have to reach back in the past to some other person who doesn't completely exist anymore. But that's another story. So a question that comes up quite often is, Gabrielle, which character are you in A.J. Fikry? The answer, of course, is none of them, and all of them in parts. I am Maya, the biracial child of readers who wants to be a writer. I'm AJ, another biracial person, an introverted person who loves books but hates the act of selling them. I'm Daniel Parrish, the embittered author / rodeo clown whose best books are behind him, who wants to be loved by the crowd more than his wife or his family. I'm everyone else in the book as well, in small ways. I'm the social worker who loves orphan stories, And I am Ismay too, who wants what she wants on her own terms. Or maybe that is not precise. While I feel as if I have been every character in the story, the way to write a character is to first know yourself and be honest about yourself, to figure out your own prejudices and biases, and then to figure out the distance between you and the person you're attempting to write. And then over time, through writing in increments, you close this distance. The act of the writer is to empathize. And strangely enough, the act of the reader is to do the same thing. Empathy is old-fashioned these days. I'm told that it is insufficient. That is to say that empathizing lets people off the hook if there isn't action attached to it. Maybe it is insufficient, but show me a better way for living in the world. To imagine that other people are complicated individuals with reasons for their behaviors, why wouldn't we all want to do this? So I want to tell you a bit about how I do my job, how I write a novel, or more specifically, how I write a character in a novel. I imagine a person, but they never arrive whole cloth. Maybe there is one detail about them at first, and then I get to know them. I try to figure out why they do the things they do. I try to figure out what embarrasses them, what drives them, what they love, what they hate, and what they're ashamed to admit, their secret shames, their secret prides, and what they would do given pressure or stress. The way I write a character is to empathize with that person intensely. And in that way, a character becomes real to me. When you do this, there are no villains or even heroes, just humans who do bad things, and humans who do great things, and humans who do neutral things just to get through their day, and humans who weren't loved enough or were loved too much, and humans who were taught things by parents who were flawed humans too, and whose parents, whose parents were so much younger than they thought. And the reason I mention this is not because I hope you all go write novels or something, though that's great if you do. The reason I mention this is because it's a very useful technique for living among actual non-character humans too. It's actually a funny trick if you can manage it. Imagine someone thoroughly and they magically will become real. So I challenge all of you to be authors and to imagine the people in your lives as fully as you can. What I know is if you can imagine someone thoroughly, you sort of become a better person. For the last year, we've all had to do a lot of imagining of things. And I want to say to you that I don't think that's ever a waste of time. I think one of the most loving things you can do for the people in your life is to imagine them, to really imagine them. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought about empathy. A major theme of the book is why it's worthwhile to create a passion for reading in a child. And what we know is that if you give a book to a kid when they're young, they start to develop empathy. Child psychologists define empathy more specifically as theory of mind, sort of the idea that there are people other than you in the world and places beyond where you currently find yourself. And in any case, this is a very useful skill for a human being going into the world. What I know is that children who read grow into adults that you want to know. So on that note, I'm going to read a little bit from the book, not too much, I promise, as I think most of you have read the book, but maybe you don't know how it sounds to me in my head, and I guess this might give you some idea. This is the part where Maya learns to read. What Feels Like the World, 1985, Richard Bosch. Chubby girl lives with grandfather, trains for elementary school gymnastics exhibition. You will be amazed by how much you care whether that little girl makes it over the vault. Bosch is able to wring exquisite tension from such a seemingly slight episode, though obviously this is the point, and this should be your takeaway. A vaulting exhibition can have every bit as much drama as a plane crash. I did not encounter this story until after I became a father, so I cannot say if I would have liked it as well PM, pre-Maya. I have gone through phases in my life when I am more in the mood for short stories. One of those phases coincided with your toddlerhood. What time had I for novels, my girl? AJF. Maya usually wakes before the sun comes up, when the only sound is AJ snoring in the other room. In footed pajamas, she pads across the main room to AJ's bedroom. At first, she whispers, "Daddy, Daddy." If that doesn't work, she says his name, and if that still doesn't work, she yells it. And if words are not enough, she jumps on the bed, though she would rather not resort to such shenanigans. Today, he wakes when she has only reached talking level. "Awake," she says. "Downstairs." The place Maya loves most is downstairs, because downstairs is the store, and the store is the best place in the world. Pants, AJ mumbles. Coffee. His breath smells like socks wet from snow. There are 16 stairs until you get to the bookstore. Maya slides her bottom down each one because her legs are too short to manage the flight with confidence. She toddles across the store, past the books that don't have pictures in them, past the greeting cards. She runs her hand across the magazines, gives the rotating stand with the bookmarks a spin. "Good morning, magazines. Good morning, bookmarks. Good morning, books. Good morning, store." The walls of the bookstore have wood panels up to just above her head, but beyond that is blue wallpaper. Maya can't reach the paper unless she has a chair. The wallpaper has a bumpy, swirling pattern, and it is pleasing to rub her face against it. She will read the word damask in a book one day and think, yes, of course that's what it's called. In contrast, the word wainscoting will come as a huge disappointment. The store is 7 Mayas wide and 12 Mayas long. She knows this because she once spent an afternoon measuring it by laying her body across the room. It is fortunate that it is not more than 20 Mayas long, because that is as far as she could count on the day the measurements were taken. From her vantage point on the floor, people are shoes. In the summer, sandals. In the winter, boots. Molly Clock sometimes wears red superhero boots up to her knees. AJ is black sneakers with white toes. Lambiasi wears finger-crushing Bigfoot shoes. Ismay wears flats that look like insects or jewels. Daniel Parrish wears brown loafers with penny in them. Just before the store opens at 10 a.m., she goes to her station, which is the row with all the picture books. The first way Maya approaches a book is to smell it. She strips the book of its jacket, then holds it up to her face and wraps the board around her ears. Books typically smell like daddy's soap, grass, the sea, the kitchen table, and cheese. She studies the pictures and tries to tease story out of them. It is tiring work, but even at 3 years old, she recognizes some of the tropes. For instance, animals are not always animals in picture books. They sometimes represent parents and children. A bear wearing a tie might be a father. A bear with a blonde wig might be a mother. You can tell a lot about a story from the pictures, but the pictures sometimes give you the wrong idea. She would prefer to know the words. Assuming no interruptions, she can make it through 7 books in a morning. However, there are always interruptions. Maya mainly likes customers, though, and tries to be polite to them. She understands the business she and AJ are in. When children come into her row, she always makes sure to stick a book into their hands. The children wander up to the cash register, and more often than not, the accompanying guardian will buy what the child is holding. "Oh my, did you pick that yourself?" the parent will ask. Once someone had asked AJ if Maya was his. "You're both black, but you're not the same kind of black." Maya remembers this because the remark had made AJ use a tone of voice she had never heard him use with a customer. "What is the same kind of black?" AJ had asked. "No, I didn't mean to offend you," the person had said. And then the flip-flops had backed their way to the door, leaving without making a purchase. What is the same kind of black? She looks at her hands and wonders. Here are some other things she wonders about. How do you learn to read? Why do grown-ups like books without pictures? Will daddy ever die? What is for lunch? Lunch is around 1 and comes from the sandwich shop. She has grilled cheese, AJ has a turkey club. She likes to go to the sandwich shop, but she always holds AJ's hand. She would not want to be left in a sandwich shop. In the afternoon, she draws reviews. An apple means the book's smell is approved. A block of cheese means the book is ripe. A self-portrait means she likes the pictures. She signs the reports Maya and passes them on to AJ for his approval. She likes to write her name, Maya. She knows her last name is Fikry, but she doesn't know how to write that yet. Sometimes after the customers and the employees have left, she thinks that she and AJ are the only people in the world. No one seems as real as he does. Other people are shoes for different seasons, nothing more. AJ can touch the wallpaper without getting on a chair, can operate the cash register while talking on the phone, can lift heavy boxes of books over his head, uses impossibly long words, knows everything about everything. Who could compare to Aj Fikry? She does not think of her mother almost ever. She knows that her mother is dead, and she knows that dead is when you go to sleep and you do not wake up. She feels very sorry for her mother because people who don't wake up can't go downstairs to the bookstore in the morning. Maya knows that her mother left her in island books, but maybe that's what happens to all children at a certain age. Some children are left in shoe stores, and some children are left in toy stores, and some children are left in sandwich shops, and your whole life is determined by what store you get left in. She does not want to live in the sandwich shop. Later, when she is older, she will think about her mother more. In the evening, AJ changes his shoes, then puts her in a stroller. It is getting to be a tight fit, but she likes the ride, so she tries not to complain. She likes hearing AJ breathing, and she likes seeing the world moving by so fast, and sometimes he sings and sometimes he tells her stories. He tells her how he had a book called Tamerlane once, and it was worth as much as all the books in the store combined. Tamerlane, she says, liking the mystery and the music of the syllables. And that is how you got your middle name. At night, AJ tucks her in bed. She does not like to go to bed even if she is tired. The offer of a story is the best way for AJ to persuade her to sleep. Which one, he says. He's been nagging her to stop choosing the monster at the end of this book, so she pleases him by saying caps for sale. She has heard the story before, but she can't make sense of it. It is about a man who sells colorful hats. He takes a nap and his hats get stolen by monkeys. She hopes this will never happen to AJ. Maya is furrowing her brow, clutching AJ's arm. What is it? AJ asks. Why do monkeys want hats? Maya wonders. Monkeys are animals. Maybe the monkeys, like the bear in the wig who is a mother, represent something else. But what? She has thoughts, but not words. Read, she says. Sometimes AJ has a woman come to the store to read books aloud to Maya and the other children. The woman gesticulates and mugs, raising and lowering her voice for dramatic effect. Maya wants to tell her to relax. She is used to the way AJ reads, soft and low. She is used to him. AJ reads, on the very top, a bunch of red caps. The picture shows a man in many colored caps. Maya puts her hand over AJ's to stop him from turning the page just yet. She scans her eyes from the picture to the page and back again. All at once, she knows that R-E-D is red, knows it like she knows her name is Maya, like she knows Aj Fikry is her father, like she knows the best place in the world is Island Books. What is it, he asks. Red, she says. She takes his hand and moves it so it is pointing to the word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That was just probably actually one of my favorite parts of the book, to be honest with you. So it was funny that you chose that.
I've actually never read it before for anything. I used to read it. I used to not read at all, but I felt more like reading lately when I'm doing this kind of thing. And I kind of went back and forth between whether I was going to read this or the later part of the book that's about Maya's short story and her coming up with that. But then I thought this might be more complete.
Yeah, no, it's a great part and so formative for Maya as a character too. I think that's why it sticks with me. And there's a lot of formative moments, I think, in the book. But so I have a bunch of questions. This would be my second time reading it, but I figure we can certainly open it up to others. And I apologize earlier that I didn't mention it. There's a Q&A component, so you can type in your Q&A if you have a question, if you want to type it into the Q&A part, or you can pop it into the chat and I would be happy to read it. Or if anybody wants to raise their hand, they're more than welcome to, and I'll be able to unmute you and you'll be able to ask verbally if you'd prefer to do that. But while we have people thinking, why don't I'll go ahead and ask you one of mine, because I think that you sort of spoke to this a little, at the beginning when you said that, which character are you? And you're a part of every character. But is there a character in the book that AJ to me, let me start, I guess, with this. AJ to me felt like a a person I kind of recognized, but I realized that it was from somebody who's very formative in my high school years, a history teacher that I had. So I was wondering, was there a defining person from your experiences or your life that really helped shape AJ as a character? Did you have anybody that really like, you were like, oh, this is the inspiration for AJ Fikry?
I mean, I have like 30 answers to this question. but the first answer I'll say is that when I wrote this book, again, now almost 10 years ago next year, at the time, what AJ was for me was a great mask I could wear, by which I mean I could say anything as AJ and nobody would think it was me. Because it just, everyone assumes, and when I do events, people most often assume that I am the Maya character. That seems closest and that tracks. But if you kind of put in somebody that seems like they are unlike you, but there are many ways in which I am AJ. I am biracial like he is, and I am somebody who, at the point I wrote the book, I think I had published 5 novels then, and I was pretty burnt out of writing novels. I'd had some that did really well, some that did pretty well, some that did not well at all. And, just kind of the grind of going had made me, the grind of promoting books had sort of made me come to a place where I had started to dislike many things that I had formerly loved, particularly bookstores. I had been somebody who loved bookstores. In fact, when I was a kid, the first place my parents let me go alone was the bookstore, but having kind of the grind of, again, promoting books and made me kind of like books less. And so I think when I wrote AJ Fikry, some of it was a pep talk for myself. And that character in many ways reflected a lot of what I was feeling at the time. But he is also just as much my dad, I would say. He is, who is, who, especially in in the part I just read, for instance, I can remember my dad reading with me, in that very patient way. And, and so much of like my early childhood literacy, I think about through both of my parents. And so some of that, AJ as a parent is definitely my parents, in terms of being very like, his sort of judgmentalness about what is good literature and what isn't good literature. That was my grandfather and my grandmother, both of like who were in education, but had really like strongly snobby tastes about what were the right things for people to be reading. I always joke and tell people that my grandfather gave me he gave me a book every time he saw me. And when I was around 12, he said, Gabrielle, I've got like the best book for you. You're going to love this book so much. The book was like the Satanic Verses, which doesn't make a great deal of sense as a gift for a 12-year-old. So AJ came a little bit from that as well. And just honestly, again, I had been on at least 2 or 3 book tours by the time I wrote The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry, and seeing again, meeting many, many booksellers, many of whom I've learned since think they are in some or part I base the character on them, but really he's a collection of all of these things, So I don't know if that was 30 answers, but it was like 7, so.
That's pretty good. That's a quarter, right? I mean, that's excellent.
Right.
So there's a question from Juliet, who's asking, is there anything you could suggest a reader could do to maximize their experience of reading and their personal growth from reading a novel? I feel like that's in some way kind of central to the story, but.
Right. It's a really good question, and I don't know that I have a great answer to it. But what I think is for me, like it comes down to just having a love of reading. So we know, and it's mentioned in the book, that there are kids who their high school teachers give them Moby Dick to read, and they're like, wow, and Moby Dick is a great book, but it is tough to get through. And then they think that they have no love of reading, and so to me, it's sort of a balance of things. You need to read a certain amount for pleasure. And I think, but in terms of personal growth, I find that I like books I don't mind being a little bored. I don't mind things that are a little bit difficult. I think a thing that we can really do as readers is kind of devote ourselves to reading. And because it is one of those kind of what they call like, I'm trying to think, slow activities, meaning, you're not constantly on like 7,000 screens. And so I think what's really useful still about paper books, though I read as much in is that you can kind of devote yourself to this without interruption. And I think that's really useful just in terms of, mental health, but also in terms of really being able to immerse yourself in a particular world. And I think in terms of like, from my point of view as an author, which is the one I have, I think that the more, and I guess I touched upon this in the talk a little bit, but the more we can kind of be open when we're entering a book, and not kind of have a lot of judgments about the world that we're being presented. Like I think for me, a kind of reader response to a book that I find frustrating is when a reader will say something like, this was not the book I was expecting, well, that's okay. It doesn't have to be the book you were expecting, so I think as much as we can, and this can be said of meeting people as well, the least kind of the more open we can be when we approach a given text or a given experience or a given human, I think the better for our personal growth and well-being.
Yeah, truer words have definitely never been spoken. I agree. I don't, I love that when it's like, it's not what I thought it was going to be. And it's like, well, it's a novel. Like, come on, if it was, maybe that takes away from it a little bit.
Well,
At
I
least,
have a friend who had a book that came out that has done very well recently. And, the book has like a twist in it that is different than what readers would expect. So in any case, the way they promoted the book was to say, this is not the love story you're expecting. And then people were like, oh, great, this wasn't the love story I was expecting. It's fine. you know.
with a disclaimer. Yeah, the
Right.
disclaimer.
As long as they had been told that they weren't going to, that this was not going to be that story, because it's less of a romance and more of a friend's love story. So it really helped positioning that book for people.
Yeah, it's true. So there's another question from Suzanne. It starts with a comment and then there's a question. So, well, Suzanne did not like the Goldfinch, but she did love Aj Fikry. Especially love the section that you read because it's so expressive of a child's mind and thought processes. It was interesting to me that Aj never mentions or even seems to consider Maya's race, and I really liked that in the book. Why did you write him that way?
It's funny. So when I wrote the book, there was a lot there to unpack. So the first thing I should say is I'm actually a big fan of the Goldfinch. I like sort of, the older I get, the more I don't mind being like immersed in something that way. As I mentioned, I don't mind being a little bit bored from time to time, to kind of, what you trade for that is this ability to be sort of like absorbed in a world. So I didn't mean to imply that I don't like the Goldfinch, only that Aj might prefer it to the Storied Life of A.J. Fikry. But to return to the question of race in the book, again, now that the book is almost 10 years old, my feelings about race are different than they were 10 years ago. But at the time, I really was aware, because as I mentioned, I'd been on several book tours, of being like the only person of color sometimes for what felt like miles and miles. And so that was something I wanted in AJ to have, that experience. I think when you're biracial, as I am, you kind of sometimes feel as if you're not really anything. You're not Asian enough, in my case, to be Asian. You're not white enough for white people to relate to you. So you sort of feel betwixt and between. And that gives you in fact, kind of a useful perspective for writing. But I wanted AJ to have that because, as I mentioned, he was a little bit me. I wanted to have a character who was living in this place but felt really outside of it. He'd come here because this was his wife's town, but not because it was his town. And so that's why AJ was biracial. And then when it came down to the next part of the story, I knew that I wanted to write a world that was more like the world that I saw it, which is to say a world that had all kinds of different people in it. And so I was interested in what it would be like to be the differently biracial daughter of a biracial man. In terms of why race isn't really foremost in the book, though I think it's in the background quite a bit. Although in the section I read, again, that is pretty much the only explicit mention of race in the whole book. And I think that's because, in a way, I wanted to write about the world as I knew it, a way in which, like, race for me is always present, but it's certainly not always the subject of everything. And this is not a book in which race is the subject, but it is still there. And so that was kind of my approach at the time. To say whether I would do it exactly the same now, well, with any of my books, I can always say I would not do it exactly the same now. I think, you know, again, that I think that, you know, as we've gone on, any of the books I've written, they can only be written by the person at the time they wrote them. So occasionally I'm asked the question, if you could rewrite your books, would you? I'm like, I could, but then they'd all just be like completely different books and they wouldn't exist at all, you know? And so for me, I, at the time, strongly felt like I wanted to, again, write a world that I recognized, that a world that has many different kinds of people in it. And so that was the storied life of Aj Fikry for me, and how I thought about race at that time.
Great, thank you. We have somebody who actually raised their hand, so I'm going to have Grania join us if she wants to unmute and ask her question.
Thank you, Lauren. Hello, Gabrielle. I have to say I love this book. I actually read it and then I also listened to it. Oh. And it was actually very nice to do that. One thing I'd just like to mention to you, that very early on in the book, AJ valued himself with he, you know, I'm glad you mentioned about this elitist point of view of booksellers, and that if you're not part of their ilk, he didn't have any time for you. And he mentioned a few times where he had this first edition book and it was worth $500,000, and it was that's what he based his value on. And he even told Maya that, you know, he owned this book and that it was worth all the other books in the store. Yet in his life, when he lost the book, Maya became the most valuable and the person that actually gave him his value in life. And it changed from a book being what defined his wealth and his value, and it was Maya that made him become more valuable, in my belief. And it was wonderful too that it wasn't until almost the end of the book that you realize that you are dealing with a biracial characters, and so I really like that too. And you know, I really, as I say, I really enjoyed the book. And also I thought it was wonderful that the book was found with crayons, markings of crayons on them. It was almost, when I was reading those passages, I could so see them picking up the book and finding crayon marks on the book and, you know, the backpack. And it was so descriptive and so wonderful. And then, you know, I did have an aha moment when it turned out that it was his sister-in-law all along that had the book. So thank you so much for being such a descriptive writer, and definitely carried us through the whole life of this person who, at the beginning, books were what he valued, and at the end it was Maya, who was a gift to him from a complete stranger. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Grania. I really appreciate that. And actually, there's a question that came in that is sort of speaks to the writing process, which I feel like Grania sort of touched on a little bit in terms of taking us through a whole story. Terry asked, what was it like to work with Kathy Porris, is that how you say your name, as an editor, and how did she help shape the story?
It's funny, I blocked it all out. I mean, you do a little bit block it all out because it's been a while since, so the process isn't quite as present to me as it once did. But I remember that, you know, Kathy was just enormously helpful in terms of thinking about the book. So one of the major changes I made was that the book wasn't really divided into two parts as it is now. You know, there was kind of like the part up till, you know, up until like Daniel is killed, and then there's the second part, which ends with AJ's death. Sorry if you haven't if you haven't read it, AJ does die. Spoiler. And so one of the things that Kathy was really helpful at that time was in kind of just getting me to slow down a little. I think for a long time, you know, I was too quick as a writer. Like I did not necessarily allow, and even still in Aj Fikry, because now I'm 2 novels past Aj Fikry, and I think I'm getting a little better at this and kind of allowing the characters to breathe and not just sort of pushing forward relentlessly with the story. And I think there are times in which, you know, I can be an impatient person and impatient reader, but I think sort of the joys in fiction are, you know, the smaller moments. And so I think if I remember correctly, the section I read was not in the book before Kathy had these kind of larger suggestions to kind of slow down and spend more time with AJ as a father and things like that. But I don't remember everything about our editorial process. I think, you know, mainly, again, most of the changes were in that part of the book, you know, in the sections kind of like, again, exploring, allowing more room to breathe with Maya and AJ were the main things we did at that time. And there's probably a lot more. I remember that during editorial, I switched around some of the short stories. It was a hard thing choosing the short stories in terms of basically like what, you know, making sure that the stories both functioned as short story references, as chapter titles. They had a lot of things they needed to do. So I found myself wanting to switch them up a little, and we did that some. And, you know, I think another thing that kind of I ended up writing more of was kind of Maya's journey as a writer. And I think that I remember that I had written more about, and I'm not sure, I know that I had already written Maya's short story in the original draft, but that there's more about the process of some of, I think, the contest and her creative writing class and some of that. So, you know, those were some of the things we worked on together at the time. And, you know, Kathy's a wonderful editor. I think she has a very gentle approach to editing books, which is something I like, because I'm, you know, really, really tough on myself. I really like to work alone. And I feel like sometimes writers tend to overshare early drafts, and that's not something I do. I don't really like your best readers. I find I want to save so they can have the experience of reading the thing that I mean to do. And so I think Kathy always gave me a lot of space in the process. So it was a really good working relationship. If Kathy's out there.
Yeah. Shout out to Kathy, right?
I don't think she is, but if she is,
Right. In the ethereal, in the
out
meta.
there somewhere for sure. But whether she's at this event, I don't know. I don't think so.
No, thank you. That's really great, and I appreciate somebody asking about sort of the craft component here. On a similar note, it's a comment or a comment and a question. So Emma Barnes asks, well, she says, first, thanks for being here, and hi, Gabrielle. I'm a longtime fan of your work and always absolutely adore the way your books immerse me so completely, and how each of your sentences is so exquisitely crafted. In your writing and editing process, which aspects do you find the most challenging? And so many manuscripts later, do any aspects surprise you?
That's a good question. I think, and thank you, and thanks for reading several books of mine. I appreciate that too. The thing I know is that no one has as much advice about how to write a novel as a person who's only written one, you know? So if you've just written one book, you're just an expert at how to get that thing done. But what I know now, because I just finished my 10th novel, at the end of last year, now it's an editorial. What I know now is that every book has had a kind of unique process, and that there are ways in which the book itself sort of dictates to you how it's going to be written. I have changed a lot in my process. It used to be, more painful for me to sit down and work. And now I work when I'm happy. I work when I'm sad. I'm not so much like, I'm not waiting for like the perfect mood to strike. I think writing is more sitting down with something many, many days and approaching something incrementally. That's how it gets good. I used to think maybe like I could just wait and have more bursts of brilliance. And now I'm much more somebody who wants to work, in a consistent way. And maybe the part of that's just being older, and needing to work in a more consistent way. Over the years, again, with, the more books I've written, the more I am patient with that. I'm patient with the fact that there are days where you don't write at all, because what's really important, and something I feel that kind of gets lost when we're talking about, say, a National Novel Writing Month or that kind of thing, is like thinking is a super important part of my process. Like it takes me a long time to really think through whether something is even a book I want to write about. I think a related question, you didn't ask this, but a related question that I'll sometimes get from, a very young writer will be like, where do ideas come from? And, the problem isn't so much where ideas come from, but what are good ideas that are worth following? And I think I have a little bit of a better sense then. I'm more willing now, having written, again, 10 novels, to be lost for a while. I'm more willing to try something, and even if it doesn't work, not really care, knowing I can like throw it out and that I can endlessly revise it. And so I feel like, if anything, that's made me more and more want to take more and more risks in my work. I also feel like, again, I'm also more patient now, because again, just writing takes time. I feel like there was one other thing I was going to say that was going to bring this all together, just like make it all sing, but I'm not sure what that was going to be. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Well, patience is always a helpful thing for sure.
For sure. Yeah.
And it does sort of bring everything together ultimately, right? Because I mean, everything sort of benefits from one.
Actually, I remembered what I was going to say, and it was the opposite of patience. It was
Oh, great.
actually the
Even
fact
better.
that, when I was, I think the thing is that sometimes people's first novels are really, really exciting. And so the thing I've tried to do recently is act as if every time I write anything, I'm a newbie. Like it's like the first time I've ever done it. Because I want to have like that sort of like feeling that, that this thing that I'm saying must be said, that this kind of like impassioned thing. You don't want to get into that place as a novelist where you're so jaded about like how the process and the patience and all that you don't have sort of the excitement of it, and so I've been trying to, again, approach the work, like I'm an amateur, and I think that's been helpful too, in a way.
For sure. Well, see, I'm glad. If I say one thing, I gave you hope.
Yeah, it could lead to it could unlock it all.
Yeah, good. That's what I was going for, to be honest. To bring it sort of, there's still a couple more questions, but I thought I would bop to this one just because it does speak to one of the, not only really the reason why the book had been chosen for the community read, but a lot of a big part of that is some of the themes, which I think I had sort of mentioned at the very, very beginning. So Janet asks, as the theme of One Book, One Belmont is resilience in the face of such loss and isolation as this last year or 15 months has brought, what brought you to write about such sadness and death at the time that you did when you were writing The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry? Because when I guess I'll mention this too, as I'm sure people know as they read it, it's funny because to me, by the end, it has a lot of uplifting qualities, even though there are a lot of, I mean, it's not inaccurate. It feels very real to life, and that, people die throughout the book, and that's true in life too. So is there something that sort of spoke to you to be able to bring all of those real life, bittersweet sort of elements together in a book that was ultimately relatively, I would say, uplifting?
Yes, I mean, at the time, what was happening in the bookstore business was dire. Basically, the Borders chains had closed, and that had been a huge, place where you could sell tons of books. And it kind of seemed like more and more independent bookstores were closing like every day. And I was really watching this from a place of self-interest. Like I would like to still be able to sell books in bookstores, and so I was thinking a lot about that. And I remembered that I wanted to write a book where a bookstore lived past its original owner. So that kind of led to the fact that Aj Fikry would die. And people do write me, and they're very angry that AJ dies, to which I can only say about that, as you said, everyone does die. And to have a book that doesn't have death in it isn't a way to deny just that we are mortal. And so to me, I have never felt that the book felt like it was filled with death, any more so than life is, And in terms of, I guess if people sense a sadness in the book, I think there's a sadness that I was thinking about this, particularly the death of a thing, which is both the death of the bookstore, the death of potentially paper books at some point, the way libraries have changed, the way in which, and so I had many of these sorts of things on my mind at the time. And I guess I was trying to work through them, to where, again, I think in a way, and maybe this, you can talk about this in the section with the sort of e-readers, I guess. You can spend all your life, fighting that things change, or you can figure out how to accept that things are different, And so I think in a way that's what, so much of AJ Fikry is about this man accepting change, and I think that's what he learns, if anything, to sort of accept that life has different seasons in it, not to be cliched, but I think that's what I would hope people felt, again, that there are many, seasons to a life and to a store.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what's interesting too is I feel like, is there maybe an actual season change around the same time that the book store it had the new seller from, um, gosh, why can't I think of the publisher, the publishing house? But it was like a beautiful day, and I feel like it was a beautiful fall day, right? So it was literally a
Right,
changing.
because basically after a certain point, it's hard to take the ferry out. So she would have had to have done all of her kind of sales calls there before winter, ideally, so yeah, it's fall, and then it actually, the book moves through seasons pretty regularly. It has a timeline that's more like that. And then time starts to mark through. Maya herself is kind of the thing that is the major way we mark time through the book. And actually, to speak to the person who asked about the editorial changes, I remember that was something we did change. Originally, the book, the publisher that Amelia worked for was called Pterodactyl Press, and we changed it to Nightly Press.
There you go. All right, so there's just, I don't know if you have time for two more questions, if that's all right. So one that came in a while ago was, person asked, I'm curious to know about the author event, or in actuality, the really fake author event,
Yeah.
and how you chose to include that. It seemed to connect to young Jane Young in some ways.
Well, I'm curious to know how it connects to young Jane Young, because I'm not sure I've ever put it together. But I will say, are you sure it's me right now, or is this somebody that I have hired to portray me? I've often had the fantasy of, I think, hiring someone else to do my events, to not have to be in person, especially when I was younger, and they were much more painful to me to face, both the idea of the empty bookstore or the empty event or whatever it's going to be. So yeah, I think that's probably where that came from. And then I was just thinking about, at the time, I remember there had been kind of around the first year I was published, there was a book that came out called Rules for Old Men Waiting, that was written by a man who was in his 80s, and everyone kind of thought that that was like extra interesting as a debut because he was so old when he wrote it. And yet nobody was particularly interested in my debut because I was just like another 27-year-old with a book, And so I remember thinking like, why does it matter so much the context of, who wrote a book? And that's obviously doubly true for memoirs, as well. I've always been fascinated with the sort of history of memoir frauds, of which there's a long one, and I have a little bit on my website about it somewhere in the like references to Aj Fikry section there. But yeah, there, so I think about that, and it matters even more today. And I do think connects to young Jane Young as I'm talking this out, which is to say, as we're in the internet era, like our identities are even more fixed in certain ways, and so it seems to matter more and more, that a person is authentically who they say they are. And I guess for readers, it seems to matter too, that say a memoir is a memoir and not a piece of fiction. And so that was kind of some of those things where that came from.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned the memoirs that end up being fake, because I feel like there is a very long history there. And
I think the standard for them was different actually as well. I think, obviously sometimes you'll see a memoir published as quote a novel or like colon a novel, and so that intrigues me when that happens. Like, what do they mean when they call a memoir a novel? But I also think that, especially now, we are more looking for the fraudulent all the time, so we're more canny of it. But if you look at sometimes, memoirs that were published, say 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there's a different standard of truth for them. I would say it's a different time, and that there's more sort of fictionalizing that happens. Even something like, say, Truman Capote's in Cold Blood, you'll see that there seems to be more liberties taken in something like that, which of course nobody thinks is fraudulent at all.
it's true.
Which isn't necessarily fraudulent at all, but just the kind of the way that the standard that we hold truth to actually changes with time. It isn't so fixed,
Yeah, absolutely. The final question, I guess, of the night, which I think is a nice one to sort of summarize and spoke to one that I was going to ask. So I'm glad that Juliet beat me to the punch here. You said at the beginning that it is a loving act to do a full imagining of and emphasizing with characters of one's imagining and our real life people. Can you see how we as humans can use that kind of empathizing towards the stories we tell ourselves and others about our lives and experiences?
That's an interesting question. I think that, to back up for 1 second, I think that when I'm speaking of imagining others, that, there's a way in which, again, it just means to have really considered how another person in your life behaves and their motivations and where they've walked before they walked in the door of your life. And I do think that your question's really smart because, I think, it risks narcissism because don't most of us spend a lot of our time imagining ourselves. But I do think, it is incredibly useful for humans to construct narratives that help them get through their lives, So for instance, last year was the year many of us had the same narrative. Many of us had different narratives, but you could call that, last year could just be the year in which we all stayed home, or it could be the year in which there was, COVID and it was very, very hard. But you could also tell yourself a different story about that time, that had to do with other things. And I think these little stories we tell are ways that we just cope and we get through our days, So I think, like, again, to spend a lot of time imagining yourself isn't maybe super useful, because I think probably at least most of us do that naturally. But to, again, give yourself a narrative, I think is something that can be very empowering.
Thank you. That's truer words have never been spoken. Gabrielle, thank you so much for being here. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.